everyone, thank you for coming. This evening I'm going to give you a little introduction to creepy crawly cuisine. So, the proper scientific term, this is a science talk, so we're going to give you one big word that you have to remember, okay? The proper term for eating insects is entomophagy. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but things that start with ento relate to insects. Phagy is a term that relates to eating stuff. So entomophagy literally means insect eating, but it can also be used to refer to eating things other than insects, so stuff like spiders and scorpions and centipedes, so all kinds of creepy crawlies. It's not actually a term that is in use in many languages. So we have a term for it in English, but in a lot of cultures, it's just eating. They don't have a special term for eating insects because it's just like eating any other type of meat. And there are a lot of people in the world that eat insects. Has anyone here ever tried any? Ooh, quite a few then. So it's not a completely alien concept, so you're all connoisseurs already, that's good news. You're in good company. Nearly a third of the world's population eat insects and other mini-beasts as a regular part of their diet. So it might seem something that's very strange to us here in the UK, but it's actually quite a normal thing for lots of people. So why do they do it? Well, there's a huge number of insects that are actually edible. Okay, so there are about 2,000 recorded species that you can eat, so that are recorded as edible, but there's probably actually quite a lot more because there are actually over 1 million described species of insects, so there's probably plenty more that we could probably actually eat, but we don't yet know about. And globally, they're eaten in a lot of countries. So if we look at the map, this shows us the countries where insects are eaten and the number of insects that are eaten in those countries. So the darker the colour, the more insects are eaten in those countries. So you can see the real hotspots are places like Mexico, China, India, and a lot of African countries. It's also very common in South America and Australia. But if you look at us all the way up there, not a very popular trend. But there are all sorts of things you can eat. The commonly eaten insects are things like crickets and grasshoppers, ants, caterpillars and other sort of worm-like grub things, scorpions and tarantulas, believe it or not. So why do people do it? Sounds pretty... Some of you might be a bit squeamish and think that's a terrible idea, but there's got to be a reason why people are eating all these insects, right? So, if you look at things that are closely related to us, so things like gorillas and orangutans and the other great apes, they all eat insects as part of their diets. Chimpanzees will dig for termites with sticks, get them out, and it's a nice lollipop snack. So it's something that early humans definitely would have done. So thousands of years ago, when humans were first evolving, they would have been eating insects, would have been a normal part of their diet. And that's persisted all over the world. But what happened when humans started to spread out? So they came out of Africa, started to move all over the world. A lot of them went north. And as you know, it's a bit chillier in the north, especially on days like today. So you don't get so many insects. And the ones that you do find tend to be smaller. So they're not quite such a good snack here. We also had the problem that we had ice ages. So humans were living through ice ages when it was very cold and there wasn't much by way of insects to eat. So that's probably the reason why in the UK today, so in this country and other European countries, it's not very common, simply because they weren't available for all that time. But it's a really big part of a lot of cultures. So Aboriginal peoples, the native people that live in Australia, insects are a huge part of their culture. So they don't only eat them, They use them as medicines. They use them in religious rituals. They're used for all kinds of things. And that's something that is common in places where insects are abundant. The other reason people eat insects, if you think back to a time before we started farming, it's quite easy to find insects, isn't it? If you go out in your garden, they're not too difficult to spot, so you can get yourself a ready snack quite easily. And they come in huge numbers. Things like locusts, termites and ants, the social insects, the ones that live in big groups, can be found in absolutely huge numbers, thousands and even millions of individuals. So if you find a good nest of ants, then you've got a snack for days, haven't you? But one of the main reasons, and one of the things that a lot of people don't realise, is that insects are actually full of protein. We all think of things like steak and fish and chicken and traditional meats as being crammed full of protein. But actually, by comparison, insects don't do too bad in their protein content. So protein's a really important part of our diet. It's what enables us to have big muscles and stay nice and strong. So if we look, this chart shows the amount of protein that are found in all different kinds of food. So obviously we've got chicken breast right at the top there. That's got 31 grams of protein per 100 grams. So it's almost a third protein if you eat chicken breast. And then we've got things like beef that are up there too, pretty high, and some seafoods like lobster. But if we look at our locusts, mealworms and crickets, they actually have a really high protein content. So that's one of the reasons why people eat them. The other good thing about them is they're actually lower in calories and they're lower in saturated fat, which is the bad type of fat that's not very good for us, than most other traditional types of meat. So you can see, if you have 100 grams of cricket versus 100 grams of beef, it's actually got less than half the calories. It's pretty good on its protein content, and it's got far less fat in it too. So they're actually quite healthy. They're really good for you. And nutritious. They also contain lots of vitamins and minerals as well. So what I want to do now is take you on a tour. So we're going to go around the world, and we're going to see who eats insects and where, and what exactly are they eating. Okay, so I will start with Africa, because Africa is one of the great insect-loving continents, and it's very common to eat insects in a lot of African countries. In Zambia, so Zambia highlighted in red here, it's really common for people to eat their beehives. So people keep bees, but rather than just harvesting the honey, they'll actually take the honeycomb and they'll eat the honeycomb, which is what the bee larvae live in and where the honey is stored. And they'll eat all the honey, they'll eat the honeycomb too, and they will eat the bee larvae. So the young bees that don't have wings yet, they're little grub-like creatures, and they make a really tasty and protein-rich snack, believe it or not. So if anyone's got a beehive, you might consider snacking on your brood in future. In South Africa and the Congo, the mapani worm is a real delicacy. Has anyone ever tried mapani worms? They are really rich and juicy. So a lot of people think of insects as being quite dry and tough. They've got their skeleton on the outside, so you think, that's going to get stuck in my teeth. But mapani worms are actually quite juicy. They're big caterpillars, so they're caterpillars of a big type of moth. And they're a real delicacy. It's common in places like South Africa to smoke them, so you can have barbecued mapani worm. Other places in Africa, again, I was talking about the social insects, so ones that live together in big groups. A classic is the termite, and termites emerge en masse. So if anyone's ever noticed when you get flying ants, and they emerge at certain times of year, termites do a similar kind of thing. So the young ones don't have any wings, but when they emerge to move on and make new colonies, they're winged like this, and that's when they're particularly favoured. You get them in huge numbers, and people fry them and make bread out of them. So interesting termite snack. Malawi, so this little country in the east of Africa. Has anyone heard of Lake Malawi? Really, really big lake out there. There are a lot of aquatic fly larvae, so baby flies, young flies, they're little worm-like creatures, they live in the lake. But when they become adults, they come out and they fly into the air in huge swarms. So you actually get millions of these flies will emerge together. And they're a type of midgie. They're called phantom midges. They're in the Kayaboride, if anyone's a keen entomologist. But they're a type of midgie. So you wouldn't initially think, midgie, that's a tasty snack, because they're absolutely tiny. But what happens is you get such huge swarms of them that people actually go out with saucepans and pots and they just swipe them through the air. And the midges get stuck and they build up into a huge layer until it's enough to make patties out of. So they'll make pate and they'll make little burgers because they get so many of these flies. You can imagine in this country it might be a bit tricky to catch enough midges to make a burger out of. But in Malawi, at certain times of the year, you can do just that. So, moving east, we get to India and China. Has anyone got any silk clothing? Does anyone wear silk? It's not so fashionable these days, is it? But if you have any real silk clothing, it will have come from the silkworm. So silkworms are, again, they're the larvae of a type of moth. So they're baby moths before the moths have got wings. So they're kind of a grub-like creature like this. And the reason why people like them so much is because when they pupate, when they're getting ready, when they form their chrysalis, just like a caterpillar does before it becomes a butterfly, they spin silk cocoons around themselves. And that is what we spin out to make silk and silk clothing. So you get these threads. People extract these threads, and that's what makes silk. But of course, you've got a little animal inside there. Most people don't want the moths to emerge, and once the silk's been extracted, they won't be able to. So you end up, as a byproduct of this industry, this big silk industry, you end up with lots and lots of silkworm pupae. So they're actually a really common snack, and you get them in supermarkets and restaurants in China and India. So China, they are particularly keen on eating pretty gross things, I've got to say it. But that's only from our cultural perspective, don't forget. So in China, scorpions are actually reared to the table. So they're a tasty snack. And they eat honeybees, they eat honeybee larvae, so again, the babies and the chrysalises of the honeybee. They fry those. You often get those deep fried and battered as quite a nice snack. And Japan, another country where eating insects is really popular. And they eat all kinds of things that a lot of other countries don't eat as much. In particular, you get caddisfly larvae. So caddisflies are aquatic insects. They live in rivers. And when they're adult, they emerge with wings. But when they're young, when they're babies, they live underneath the water. And the Japanese harvest these. They get loads of caddisflies together. And again, they make a tasty snack. They also put wasps in their rice crackers. So you may well have eaten a rice cracker, but the chances are you haven't eaten one with loads of wasps in it. And this is something that started in the highlands. It was really common in the highlands of Japan, but it's actually getting more fashionable now in the city. So you're starting to see these rice crackers appearing on supermarket shelves. Thailand, again, loads of people in Thailand eat insects. Are we seeing a theme here? It's pretty normal. But in Thailand, the government has actually encouraged people to eat grasshoppers because they're such a big problem in terms of affecting crops and rice fields and things like that. So when people are trying to grow plants to eat, often you get huge swarms of insects and they'll come in and feed on your food. So one way of getting around that is to feed on them. So the government had quite a big campaign to encourage people to catch and eat grasshoppers and try and reduce the amount of damage that was being done to crops. Cambodia, if there are any arachnophobes here, I apologise. You might want to look away. But insects aren't eaten quite as much in Cambodia. Spiders are. So tarantulas are a really popular dish. And again, they just catch them, cook them, fry them, grill them, and they eat the tarantulas whole. And it's something you can often find as street food. So if you're ever a tourist in Cambodia, you will find things, we get hot dogs and burgers sold on the street in this country. Cambodia, you get big piles of tarantulas. And in Bali, so Bali's part of Indonesia, it's a little island just in the middle here, they actually eat dragonflies. It's quite unusual. There's not many countries where dragonflies are eaten, but people will go out and catch the adults from the air, and they'll pull the wings off, and they will cook them. And it's quite a delicacy. Again, they're really fleshy animals, so you get a lot of protein, a lot of goodness in there, and they're considered really, really tasty. So, Australia. So, we're coming to the end of our world tour. But Australia in particular is a great place for insects. As I said earlier, it's a big part of Aboriginal culture. So they eat all kinds of insects. Moths, ants, bees, termites. And one of their favourites is the witchetty grub. So again, this is a caterpillar of a type of moth. It's used to refer to quite a few different species of moths. But it's really big and fat and juicy, so it's a massively tasty snack for the native people of Australia. I think the European settlers that came over didn't really take it up very much. So, lastly, Latin America. So, Central and South America, these countries here, places like Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, Peru, Mexico. They love eating insects too. It's a big part of their culture. And again, it's not just native peoples. This is something that the settlers have taken on. So the Spanish people that went over to Mexico, they love eating insects. It's very common. And again, a huge number of different things are eaten. Cicadas. Has anyone ever been to a country where you hear cicadas calling? Yeah? These big bugs that sit on trees and chirp quite loudly. One way of stopping them irritating you is to eat them. So that's what they do in lots of South American countries. And I'm sure quite a lot of you might have heard of the tequila worm. So that mysterious worm that you get at the bottom of tequila. Again, that's the type of caterpillar, so it's a baby moth. And they're eaten. They don't just put them in alcohol, they fry them, they toast them, they do all sorts with them. And the agave worm in particular is what you get in bottles of things like tequila and mezcal, which is a Mexican type of alcoholic drink. So a bit of protein at the end of your drinking is probably good. So, they're eaten everywhere. Not so much in this country. Or are they? One of the problems that we have in the world currently is that there are lots of us. And the human population is growing at an unprecedented rate. We've got to feed all of these people. One of the big problems with the traditional types of thing that we eat, so things like cows and pigs and chickens, is that they take up a lot of space. So although you might think, okay, a chicken's not really that big an animal, how can they be taking up so much room? A lot of our farmland is used not only to keep animals on, but it's used to grow crops to feed those animals. So in the winter, when the cows come in, they can't eat grass anymore, so they get fed on things that have been grown for them during the summer. And actually 70% of our arable land is used for rearing animals or growing crops that are simply fed to animals, which seems a little bit crazy to me. As a vegetarian, my argument is, well, we could just eat the crops ourselves. But if you're talking about trying to get a huge protein content, one solution is to rear insects. They physically take up a lot less space, but they also require a lot less resources. So you can farm them vertically, you can farm them upwards. So you can't really stack one cow on top of another, but you can have huge columns of crickets and locusts. That's perfectly achievable. They don't need as much food, and they don't create as much waste either. So something that is actually very seriously being looked at by the United Nations is eating insects, creating them as a food source, not just for native peoples in the tropics, but everywhere, a global solution to our food problems. And there's lots of perks. So like I was saying, the amount of food that is needed by different animals to produce so much protein varies massively. So a cow, you've got to feed a cow more than 9 kilograms of food to produce 1 kilogram of beef that you can eat. If you rear a mealworm, you only need about 1.5 kilograms. So that's a huge difference. The other good thing about insects is they don't produce so much of those nasty greenhouse gases. So you may or may not know about CO2 causing global warming. One big contributor to those emissions of things like CO2 and methane, which is another even more potent greenhouse gas, is cow waste and cow farts. So cow farts and poo produce a lot of greenhouse gases. Crickets don't fart quite so much, as you might imagine. So, where does the future lie? It's changing in the UK. There are a lot of companies now that have started producing edible insects, and they're trying to make them a little bit more palatable for the Western market. So for those of us that are not used to eating insects as part of our culture, you can get things like these lovely sort of sushi rolls and burgers where there's no obvious trace of an insect in them. So they're kind of adapting to a market where we're a little bit scared of eating insects because we think it's weird or creepy. And the first insect-eating restaurant has opened in Wales. So it's growing. And as a consequence, I've got a selection of things for people to try in the interval. So after the second talk, we're going to have a little break. And if anyone's feeling brave, you can try some mealworms, some baby beetles, some grasshoppers, and some crickets. Okay? One thing I will say, insects are a pretty safe food, but it is possible if anyone's got a shellfish allergy, you may also be allergic to insects. So just a warning, if anyone's allergic to seafood, tread carefully because you may have an allergy to insects. But hopefully, most of you don't, and you're all going to be brave in the interval and try some edible bugs, because it's the future.